right, today we have Dr. Kojonen. He will be talking to us about methodological naturalism and some responses to objections against it. All right, Dr. Kojonen, it's all yours.
So I'm going to be talking about methodological naturalism and the truth-seeking objection. And I regard this as the most important objection which I have encountered in the intelligent design debate against methodological naturalism. And I've also heard it alluded to at least a few times here, although I've never heard it called the truth-seeking objection before, so this is my own term for it. So as some background first, when I first started to get into the intelligent design evolution discussion, one thing that struck me was how very different the interpretations of reality were being said. Like first instance, I quote here Michael J. Behe, the biochemist, who argues that the overwhelming appearance of design, is talking about the design in nature, strongly affects the burden of proof. In the presence of manifest design, the onus of proof is on the one who denies the plain evidence of his eyes. When it seems sometimes when I read Behe's writings and the writings of other idea proponents that it seems like it's almost enough to just describe how nature functions, and that should already be enough to bring us the idea of design. It's so obvious, so clear. And then we come to someone like Dawkins, who does say that, well, yes, we have this intuition of design, but when we look closer, then the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. So the question quite naturally arises, how do we explain the existence of such diametrically opposed interpretations of reality? Now one way of explaining why this is to say that it's the result of different methodologies, different starting assumptions that are brought to nature, which influence how the mind reads nature. So an ID proponent, for example, might argue that Dawkins is adopting, or those who think like Dawkins are adopting some form of methodological naturalism, and they exclude design already in principle, so that's why they have to abandon these ideas. Okay, but looking into this discussion led me then to write my doctoral dissertation in the philosophy of religion and theology on the debate, trying to look at this philosophical and theological discussion. And also after that, this upcoming book, which is coming out actually from Routledge, so it says here that it's coming from Adscape, the intelligent design debate and the temptation of scientism. And what I'm going to be talking about comes also from this book. It's a very small part of it, and I've been trying to sort of develop and refine one portion of the argument. So that's what I'll be saying here. It's going to be start here with some background from the definition of methodological naturalism, and before going into the truth-seeking objection to methodological naturalism. Then I'll bring out two different ways how methodological naturalists might respond to the truth-seeking objection, and then conclude on scientism and ponder why or whether the question of methodological naturalism is important at all. So if we look at the origin of the term methodological naturalism, it is actually quite a young term. Though as we've heard in this conference, the preference for natural explanations in the natural sciences does go back to the Middle Ages at least, or even to antiquity. But Paul de Vries of Wheaton College in the US wrote this article, Naturalism in the Natural Sciences, in 1986. And there he made the distinction between metaphysical and methodological naturalism. And de Vries's point was that, well, we have within the sciences this preference for natural explanations. Or actually, the sciences don't just have a preference for natural explanations, they completely bar the supernatural there. So supernatural is just something that you cannot investigate in scientific terms. But de Vries's point was that this is actually distinct from the thesis of metaphysical naturalism, which is the belief that the supernatural does not exist. So methodological naturalism as such, it doesn't make a truth claim saying that there is no supernatural things, or there is no rationality to supernatural, belief in the supernatural. Methodological naturalism just says that, well, science is not the place to think about methodological naturalism. Now, in the intelligent design debate and in the debate over creation and evolution, methodological naturalism has been an important part of the attempt to try to sort of restrict the public influence of intelligent design and creationism and to bar its teaching from public schools, at least. So philosopher Michael Roos's definition of methodological naturalism is quite important. And in the 1987 trial over the teaching of creationism, Roos, under the influence of Roos, 5 main criteria of science were defined to exclude creationism from public schools. They were, first, that science must be guided by natural law. Second, it explains by reference to natural law. Third, it is testable against the empirical world. Fourth, its conclusions are tentative. And fifth, it is falsifiable. So the courts followed Roos's testimony and concluded that creationism is barred. Well, after the trial, much critical discussion has ensued about this criteria, and some critics of creationism have also argued that they were not really philosophically rigorous, and the definition of science is too complex to be decided by courts of law. For example, philosopher of science Larry Lorden argued that though the banning of creationism was desirable, the criteria used to demarcate between science and pseudoscience in the trial were problematic, because Lorden argued that actually scientific creationism contains much that is testable and which has been actually tested and found false, such as the idea that the Earth is actually only under 10,000 years old. So creationism should, according to Lorden, rather be discussed as a bad scientific theory. So there are some differences between this Roos's definition of methodological naturalism and the usual definition used in the ID movement. Because note that the Roos is only barring supernatural forces. But if we read proponents of ID, then they usually say that ID doesn't say that the designer has to be supernatural, although that is the most credible idea of the identity of the designer. It usually still said that it's that methodological naturalism also bars all other than non-intelligent natural causes. It also bars finite intelligences such as extraterrestrials from science, it's argued. And so it's so the definition is somehow different here. But in any case, proponents of ID and critics of ID both understand methodological naturalism to bar all references to design from biology. This is for critics of ID, it's because the designer is actually understood to be supernatural despite the ID proponents' disavowals of this. But actually, if we look at the literature carefully, we can distinguish between 2 types of methodological naturalism. First, there's strong methodological naturalism, as in Roos's terms, traditional position and the basis of excluding ID from classrooms. But looking at Larry Lorden and others, we can also find this form of moderate methodological naturalism, which argues merely that supernatural explanations are to be rejected or accepted on practical grounds, like how good is their evidence. And it's argued that actually these have already been tested and found false, and so that's why they should be rejected. Often critics of ID like Martin Baudry argue that, well, if we adopt this strong methodological naturalism, then we lose our biggest weapon to fight against ID and all kinds of pseudoscience and religious belief. Rather, we should say that these are actually scientific hypotheses which have been tested and which can be tested and found false. Actually, one might even describe proponents of ID as moderate methodological naturalists, since they usually also say that science should prefer natural explanations, but only go to design-based explanations after we have excluded all chance and the necessity-based explanations. So what's the truth-seeking objection then to methodological naturalism? I find this already in Philip Johnston's writings, the early visionary of the ID movement. But I think it's best said probably by the agnostic atheistic philosopher Bradley Monton in his book Seeking God in Science, an Atheist Defends Intelligent Design. And Monton says that if science really is committed to methodological naturalism, then it automatically follows that the aim of science is not generating true theories. Instead, the aim of science would be something like generating the best theories that can be formulated subject to the restriction that those theories are naturalistic. So I have drawn, using the wonderful technology of MS Paint, this area of possible explanations and divided into naturalistic and non-naturalistic explanations. Now let's suppose that the X on the map there means that the true explanation of some phenomenon is actually non-naturalistic. Like actually, let's suppose that the origin of life was a supernatural creation event by God. Now even if this is true, then methodological naturalism would make it impossible to find this truth through the natural sciences. So this means that the natural sciences would no longer be seeking for truth. Rather, they would only be searching for the best naturalistic explanation. And we could say that, well, we have this, we have some kind of beginnings of the origin of life explanation in naturalism, but this would not be true. And this would not be a very good explanation, but they would still be the accepted, the best scientific explanation. So science would actually be, in this case, according to the truth-seeking objection, science would lead us astray from the truth. Let me formulate it with some premises to perhaps make it more clear. The first premise states the general aim of science as being the generation of theories and models that are as close to true as possible about the world. Now, science doesn't necessarily always get the truth because we always try to formulate better and better theories. So that's why I've said we try to get as close to the truth as possible. We are trying to get as the best models we can, as reliable as we can. So of course, if that's the goal, then the methodology of science should be chosen in such a way as to make attaining this goal as likely as possible. Okay, that seems self-evident. Well, if the true explanation of natural history is not actually naturalistic, then methodological naturalism would actually hinder science from attaining its goal of finding the true explanation. That's how the truth-seeking objection goes. So now if we assume that it's in principle at least a somewhat credible possibility that the true explanation of natural history is not naturalistic but supernatural, then it becomes more plausible that methodological naturalism might hinder science from finding out the truth and therefore conflict with the goals of science. And therefore it should be abandoned and we should instead select a more inclusive scientific method which does not leave design out of the toolkit of explanations. So that's the basic argument against methodological naturalism based on truth-seeking. Now, how could we respond? How could a naturalistic or other critic of ID respond to this? Well, one possible way that comes immediately to mind would be to criticize premise 4 and say that, well, actually, it's not at all a credible possibility that there is anything supernatural going on in the history of life or on Earth at all. How could we argue this, that it's not incredible, that it's not credible? Well, we could adopt some kind of belief in metaphysical, philosophical naturalism, the idea again that there's no God. Well, of course, if there's no God, then it's not very credible that God has acted in natural history. There's also, we could believe in God, but formulate a theology emphasizing the regularity of nature. For example, we might argue that God wanted to create an orderly world which we could study completely, even in its natural history. God always works through secondary causes and not, at least usually, through any sort of miraculous action. Well, in that case, it becomes very credible that we might also find natural laws that guided the evolution of life. Now, if we formulate a theology emphasizing the freedom of God to act in the world, God is omnipotent. He can do whatever he wills. This is the kind of theology that was also formulated by Philip E. Johnson in his critique of methodological naturalism. On such a theology, the probability that God might have acted in natural history becomes better. So the premise for becomes more credible. But the problem here seems to be that we are in very deep theological and philosophical waters now. And we can't really base our method of science on such a on any minority philosophy or theology. Only a small minority of people are actually philosophical naturalists, and only a small minority of people have this kind of theology so strongly emphasizing the regularity of nature to such a degree that all kinds of miraculous action in natural history is completely implausible. So we really need some kind of a more neutral sort of a basis to either affirm or deny the credibility of premise 4. So I would say that one possible way to state that premise 4 is at least somewhat credible would be to appeal to our intuitions about life. And I'm quoting from David Hume, who was a notorious critic of natural theology and also the design argument. And his dialogues concerning natural religion nevertheless seem to point out that the conclusion of design is very intuitive and initially plausible. Cleanthus says that surely the most obvious conclusion is in favor of design, and it requires time, reflection, and study to summon up those frivolous though abstruse objections which can support infidelity. Now, okay, we might disagree about the designiness of the cosmos and the designiness of life after study, but nevertheless, there seems to be something odd about ignoring a possible explanation completely if it is so initially so credible, so intuitive to us. So I would say that this sort of this lends at least some initial credibility to premise 4 that God might have acted, or that we might at least have to take into account the possibility of design in our truth seeking, even if we ultimately form a view where this design is not in conflict with the sciences, or if we reject design as an explanation altogether. Well, actually, so then the better way, which I think is to defend methodological naturalism, would be to concentrate on premise 3. Like, yes, science aims at generating theories and models that are as close to true as possible. Yes, the methodology of science should be chosen in such a way to make attaining this goal as likely as possible. But does methodological naturalism hinder science from attaining its goal of finding true explanations? Well, we might deny this premise in several ways. For instance, we might adopt moderate methodological naturalism, as Martin Baudry, who is pictured here, does. Moderate methodological naturalism is, by the way, my own positive sounding term for this view. He might say that it's provisionary methodological naturalism or just methodological naturalism. But I think that both of these forms are actually provisionary, so I made up my own term here. So if we are in principle open to design, if science is in principle open to design, then this of course avoids the truth-seeking objection against methodological naturalism completely. Hence, design is actually not barred from science at all. Now, another thing is that the rules of rationality which we adopt must not be biased against design, and this might require expanding the nature of natural science, which may not be desirable. I'll come back to this later. This personal explanation versus scientific explanation issue. Usually these are have to be quite different. For example, Dawkins might in principle be characterized as a moderate methodological naturalist because he actually argues that even God is a scientific hypothesis, and argues that, well, we can test this hypothesis. It's sort of an attempt at explaining the world, but science just gives us better explanations, and that's why we can abandon belief in God. But on the other hand, Dawkins does adopt this kind of rules of rationality which heavily favor natural explanations and heavily favor leaving aside any belief in God, because Dawkins says that any good scientific explanations must ultimately be reductive. It must go back to ever simpler and simpler causes through which we can sort of better and better predict what happens. But God is not, according to Dawkins, an explanation like that, because God is, for Dawkins, very complex as a sort of a supermind, an infinite being. Well, we might say that actually Dawkins' idea of God's complexity is very strange theologically, not very credible. But in any case, these principles of rationality lead Dawkins to say that even pure luck, blind luck, is a better explanation of the origin of life than design. So I think this kind of methodological naturalism is still vulnerable to the truth-seeking objection, where you might say initially that yes, certainly we are open to all kinds of explanations, but in actuality you formulate the playing field in such a way that there's no way to ever come up with good evidence against your point of view. Actually, Dawkins' view seems to be sort of closed to criticism and closed to falsification in this way, because in any case, even pure luck would be a better explanation than design. And as many critics have said, Dawkins adopts these kinds of rules of rationality, which make actually Darwinian evolution sort of the certain conclusion already based on a priori considerations. This has been stated by biologist Alan Orr, who is himself not a religious person. So how might we defend strong methodological naturalism without scientism? Now, recall that strong methodological naturalism says that design is already, or supernatural design is already in principle something that is outside of natural sciences. Well, we would have to simply reject scientism. Scientism is the belief that science is the only way of gaining knowledge about the world. And I put here a picture of one critique of scientism, because I don't really have time to go into the details of why science is not the only way to gain knowledge. But scientism is the idea, it's actually a philosophical idea. That's not a result of any natural scientific experiment. And the idea says that science is the only way to know. But let's suppose then that science is actually not the only way to know. In that case, then there's no reason why methodological naturalism should lead us astray, because if science is not the only way to know, then it's in principle possible for us to come across some phenomenon which is actually not best explained through methodologically naturalistic science. We would simply say that, well, this is the border of science. Natural science stops here, and maybe theology begins, or philosophy begins, or perhaps some other humanistic discipline. Maybe this is where archaeology begins, or so on. So this kind of idea that there are many disciplines is very common behind this also methodological naturalism in theistic evolutionist thought. So if we look at also the mainstream philosophy of science, as Pascal's stratified account of reality is thought that actually we don't have to reduce everything to just one scientific discipline like physics, but rather there are emergent levels of reality, whatever this mysterious word emergence means. Sometimes it's better understood, sometimes it's worse understood, but in any case we have several different disciplines. Some phenomena seem better explained and studied through the methods of psychology. In some cases we have to use the methods of chemistry, methods of physics, the methods of biology. Some cases we have to combine many different methods. So it's a very dynamic situation. And let's suppose that the methodological naturalist adopts this kind of very dynamic understanding of the nature of science and rejects the idea that the natural sciences are the only way to know. Then I don't think there's any problem in even strong methodological naturalism for the truth-seeking objection, because you can always say that, well, let's suppose that the origin of life really was a supernatural creation event. Then we could in principle come to the conclusion that this is the border of this is the end of methodologically naturalistic science, and this is where theology begins. Or a proponent of idea might argue that we just need some new kind of science, because the borders of science, different disciplines, aren't revealed to us in any kind of holy scripture. but rather they must be determined based on our experience of the world. And our experience of what kind of method of explanation bring out the best kind of results. So in this kind of approach, methodological naturalism must be, as Robert C. Bishop states in his own history of methodological naturalism, that this is how it began as an approach to scientific investigation that seeks to take phenomena on their own terms to understand them as they actually are. So this kind of view does avoid the critique of the truth-seeking objection. It's also how philosopher Hans Halvorson, for example, defends methodological naturalism in the new Blackwell Companion to Naturalism. So coming to my closing now. In principle, the cultural authority of science makes demarcation between science and pseudoscience interesting. And I can understand why it has been such a huge focus in the ID debate, because people want to have the cultural authority of science behind either evolution or design. But I think that if we were to reject scientism, then perhaps we could concentrate more on the search for truth and evaluate how good arguments are rather than whether they are science or not. For example, if we have a good philosophical argument for design, then that would also be just as valuable as a good scientific argument for design. It could give us good grounds for believing in design, or we might also have a good philosophical argument against design, or a theological argument against design or for design. And this would also, I think, have to be brought into the discussion. Everybody has philosophical ideas and theological ideas in this discussion. That's what I've discovered, at least in reading both critics and defenders of ID. But often the philosophy and theology is sort of hushed away a bit too much, I think, rather than being discussed and valued. We might value philosophical and theological reasons. So I've also said that one other conclusion that follows from this presentation is that on both of these defenses of methodological naturalism, ID must be rejected or defended based on the evidence. Like if you're a moderate methodological naturalist, then you must reject ID based on its failure in practice. There's no a priori reason to reject it. On the other hand, if you're a strong methodological naturalist, you still have to somehow defend the idea that a certain phenomenon belongs indeed to the realm of methodological naturalistic biology, for example, rather than to the realm of theology or philosophy of religion, or to some new kind of science, such as archaeology. You have to defend the boundaries of science and to defend the idea that, yes, our methodological naturalistic science is the best way to solve this problem. And you have to do this defending based on the evidence. So this means that you can't ignore or just bypass any argument that says otherwise, such as ID's critiques. So I think in conclusion that methodological naturalism plus scientism is the problem, both theologically and for proponents of ID, but pure methodological naturalism should not necessarily be a problem. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much, Dr. Kojonen. All right, I will open up the floor for questions now. All right, David says, following evidence to the truth has always been his preferred methodology. That seems like a good point. Okay, Jim Lemaster wants the initial definition of strong methodological naturalism back on the screen.
You mean this one?
Yeah, I believe that's the correct one. Yep, he's happy with that.
I have a lot more quotes and references in my written paper.
I have a comment. This is Salvador Cordova.
Hi, Salvador.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm an ID proponent. I'm a creationist. But unlike a lot of my colleagues, I actually don't think intelligent design should qualify as science. So in an odd sort of way, I'm somewhat sympathetic to the things you've articulated here.
Yeah, I think it's ultimately a side issue if the main purpose is truth-seeking. Now, politically and culturally, it might be an important issue, maybe whether it's science or not. But I think that at least speaking as now as a theologian and philosopher of religion, I think that scientism is a pretty big problem. That people think that the only way of gaining truth is through the natural sciences. When actually, I think we have a lot of pretty good theological and philosophical arguments also that should go into building our worldview and also on whether we believe in God or not.
We have
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
On whether ID is science or not, I really empathize with Robin Collins's position that ID is the sort of meta-scientific idea, that it has some parts which are very analogical to the natural sciences, and then some parts which are more analogical perhaps to the humanities or to the philosophy of religion. So I think it would be, because your personal explanation is kind of different than law-based explanation, for example. It doesn't have the same kind of mathematical tractability, really, this explanation, even though you might be able to formulate something like specification and exclusion of chance and design mathematically. Teleology and teleological explanation is really something quite different. We wouldn't even have the whole category of consciousness if we were just relying on the natural sciences and the methods of natural sciences. So I think it's a broader term, but one might call it a science, a new kind of science, or one might call it something else. It's not really the central issue, I think.
All right, I have a question from Jim Lemaster. He's asking, what do you think Bishop means by taking phenomena on their own terms?
Well, I think he means just that nature is best studied using this kind of scientific methods. Like you try to, so when you try to examine nature, then you try to find out the truth about them, and you can get quite very fruitful results using scientific methods and trying to formulate theories that are sort of predictive, testable, and we can form hypotheses and get math and everything. But I don't think Bishop wouldn't say that sciences are the only way of getting knowledge. He would say, and usually people in the theology and science community, people who study the relationship of religion and science, would say that there are lots of stuff that don't fit and can't be discovered through the criteria of science. Okay, wonderful.
Okay, we have, let's see, 2 more questions, and then I'm going to have to switch things over. Okay, David asks, what do you think of calling ID an interdisciplinary project? Oh, okay, we got a third question too. Okay, Ruben, yeah, type your question into.
I think, David, I think that's one promising way of saying that. But again, I think the boundaries of disciplines are quite fluid. But I would sort of try to find analogies with the search for extraterrestrial intelligence or archaeology or something like that, and call it a new kind of science or something like that, if I wanted to describe it as a science. But I tend to think that beliefs about ID are so much influenced by our theological and philosophical views, whether they're atheistic or theistic or whatever, that it's very hard to discuss it just as a scientific idea, because it's so dependent on this broader belief. So I would rather just discuss the issues without being so careful about which part is science and which part is philosophy and so on. Well, we can try to be careful, but that's not my central focus.
Okay, let's see, Ruben, oh wait, sorry, Jim Lemaster has a question, and then we'll get to Ruben. I'll unmute Ruben so he can ask his question. Okay, Jim Lemaster's question is, how do we know that nature's terms are what you just listed?
Well, I would say that we would have to know it based on our experience. So we can't know it a priori, and so we can't determine the boundaries of disciplines a priori on the sort of in principle grounds, but rather we have to actually study nature and see what works.
All right, now I'm going to unmute so that Ruben can ask his question. All right, Ruben, you should be able to ask a question.
Rob, thank you very much for your presentation. I found it very interesting and especially encouraging that much of your thinking is very similar to my own thinking in this subject. I do have an objection to your argument, your truth-seeking objection to methodological naturalism, because there are many things that might be true. For instance, we might be living in the matrix, I might be a brain in a vat, the world might be created 5 minutes ago, including all our memories. But just the mere possibility that something is true does not make it intellectually respectable. So, similarly, supernaturalistic hypotheses might be true, but that doesn't make them respectable in an intellectual way. So how would you respond to that?
Well, yeah, I think that's a very relevant comment that there are lots of things that might be possibilities that we don't consider in any way. So that's why I wrote that it has to be at least somewhat a credible possibility. That if we find that it's a completely incredible possibility, something that's, or perhaps we might say that something that we can't investigate in any way, then of course that would be a good response to the truth-seeking objection. That, well, it might be true or it might not be true, that we just can't know. My own objection to people saying that we actually live in a matrix, I don't know, I don't think anybody actually says that, but I would just say that, well, we don't have any evidence that we are actually living in the matrix, so we can continue living based on our best knowledge so far and what the evidence seems to say.
All right. We don't have other questions. I have one question. What if intelligent design actually contradicted what methodological naturalism predicts? It seems like in that case it would be in direct conflict with methodological naturalism.
What do you mean by contradiction, what methodological naturalism predicts? Does methodological naturalism actually make predictions?
Well, it predicts the world as a certain way if it just operates according to natural causes.
I might say that those are predictions that we can make based on methodological naturalistic theories of science, but I would say that methodological naturalism itself is just a methodology. It doesn't, in order to generate predictions, you need to combine it with some kind of theoretical framework, maybe some empirical study. But of course, if ID made better predictions about nature, and or if methodological naturalism fails to explain some phenomenon, and it seems that it's actually better explained through intelligent design, then that would, I think, be a good way of arguing that this is the border of the natural sciences of methodological naturalism, and to explain that phenomenon, then we need something else like ID, or perhaps something even different. And David says that this seems to emphasize that theology is the queen of the sciences. Well, let me take this this one graph, which I took this from Arthur Peacock, this graph of the hierarchy of the sciences. And he doesn't have theology in there, but sometimes in the theology and science community, at least, theology is, might indeed, if it features into this hierarchy, it might be thought precisely as this sort of broadest possible discipline, unifies all sorts of stuff. Then talks about the ultimate explanation of reality, whereas science talks about these small-scale phenomena. Or to say that theology also couldn't talk about small-scale phenomena, that actually theologians would say that God's glory is, of course, present everywhere.
General Master says, thank you, Dr. Kojonen.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening in.
Yeah, I thought this was a good talk. It's a good high-level view of everything to kind of orient the whole discussion. So I thought it was really good in that regard.
Yeah. And in addition to my book, I want to say that I also have a paper on the guard of the gaps coming out, which ties directly into this same topic in the Journal of Analytic Theology. It's coming out in May, but if anybody wants it, I can send you the PDF.
All right. With that, I would like to thank Dr. Kojonen again, and then I'll shut things down.